Well, good morning, everyone. We're going to begin our presentation. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Statutory and Regulatory Requirements, Anticipating Expectations Within a Quality Management System, ISO 9001 Audit. My name is Joseph Krolikowski, and I am the QMS Program Manager for Perry Johnson Registrars. Couple of notes for everyone. All of our participants today are on mute, but we absolutely want to address your questions, so I invite you to utilize the question portion of the dashboard. We will definitely take your questions at the conclusion of today's presentation. I'll also note one of the questions that we get a lot is, will this presentation be available later? We will be sharing the slides very shortly after we're finished, and if you want to watch the webinar again with voiceover, we make all of our webinars available through our website under the link previously recorded webinars. Our presentation for today is going to cover the following topics. We're going to start with an exploration of what statutory and regulatory requirements are. We're going to do some compare and contrast, give a few examples. We're going to dig into why statutory and regulatory requirements are being assessed in the context of an ISO 9001 audit. We will review where statutory and regulatory requirements are found in both the 2008 and 2015 revisions of ISO 9001. We will give some examples of how statutory and regulatory requirements might be assessed within the audit, a couple of concluding remarks, and then your questions. So let's begin with what are statutory and regulatory requirements, and we'll start with the official definitions as presented in the ISO 9000 document, also known as Fundamentals and Vocabulary. A statutory requirement is defined as an obligatory requirement specified by a legislative body. A regulatory requirement is defined as, again, an obligatory requirement specified, but this time by an authority mandated by a legislative body. So let's dig in a little bit to try to understand the difference. The key difference between the two is where the requirements come from. Statutory requirements, as the name would imply, they come from statutes, and that's another way of saying they come from legal requirements. These are going to be represented by laws that come from state or federal government. Now, a regulatory requirement, by way of comparison, these come from regulations. So things like EPA requirements, OSHA requirements, FDA, FAA, and so forth. Now, EPA, OSHA, these are folks that are authorized by these government bodies. So regulations are generally going to be rules that are issued by such an agency, and that agency has been given authority by the government to regulate some industry or to do something, and it can often be found in the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR. So here's an example. The Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, is statutorily authorized to regulate food and drug safety through the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Safety Act. Now, more specific labeling and packaging requirements are going to be found in Title 21 of the CFR. These are regulations that are issued by the FDA in order to help them fulfill their statutory authority to regulate. Now, I've just said a whole lot of words here. Why don't we try to simplify this just a bit? Again, a statute is the law, and very often the law is going to be general. Regulations are intended to be more specific. They're going to interpret the law and give people specific guide points for staying within the law. So again, let's illustrate this with an example. The statute may say that For example, excessive levels of pollutants shall not be permitted in or near major bodies of water, or something along those lines. Now, the EPA might issue a regulation that says, what do we mean by an excessive level? What do we mean by a major body of water? And it may also give the plan for what the enforcement is going to be in terms of what Congress originally intended. So to kind of bring this back to macro, why are we auditing these things? Well, PJR is an accredited certification body. We are held accountable to a number of requirements, some of which are industry-wide, some of which are driven by certain sectors. Probably the most preeminent important requirement that we're held accountable to is ISO 17021. This is the requirements for certification bodies, obviously issued by the ISO itself. That standard has a clause that reads as follows. Auditing shall include the client's management system ability and its performance regarding the meeting of applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. In other words, when we audit you, we have to ensure that you have an effective process in place to address applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. Now, as I mentioned at the start of my presentation, there are certain clauses within ISO 9001 itself that address statutory and regulatory requirements. Now, if we go back to 2008, there were 3 auditable clauses that mentioned it. In 51A, it stated that management had to provide communication to the organization at large on the importance of meeting statutory and regulatory requirements. In 721C, it established a requirement for including statutory and regulatory requirements among the items determined during the contractual phase with your customers. And it included a requirement in the design section in 732B, stating that you needed to include statutory and regulatory requirements among the various design inputs. Now, in ISO 9001:2015, all 3 of those expectations were upheld and 3 more were added. So in ISO 9001:2015, we start with clause 512A. Again, management needs to ensure that statutory and regulatory requirements are determined, understood, and consistently met. It's a little bit stronger verbiage than what we had in 2008. Again, we have a contractual clause, 822A1. Be sure that we include statutory and regulatory requirements among the items determined during the contractual phase. 8231D, we have now a requirement that statutory and regulatory requirements be reviewed prior to committing to supply a product or service. So that's, again, we can kind of read into it and say, well, that's probably what they meant when they were talking about it in 2008, but now they've come out and said it explicitly. So not only are we determining applicable statutory and regulatory requirements, we're reviewing applicable statutory and regulatory requirements prior to committing to supply a product or service. Then 3 additional clauses, again, a design clause, and this one reads pretty much the same as what we had in 2008. Be sure that we include statutory and regulatory requirements among design inputs. Then we have a couple of additional new clauses. Section 8.4, of course, is the external provider clause, and we have a statement here that the organization has to ensure that external providers are not adversely affecting compliance to statutory and regulatory requirements. And then finally, post-delivery activities, which is a newer section in the standard, indicating that The extent of post-delivery activities is going to be influenced by statutory and regulatory requirements. This gets into things like recycling, end of life, and so forth. So 2015 has added quite a few pieces to this puzzle in terms of where these requirements are referenced. So in terms of how PJR has opted to approach the requirement, we have chosen to take a fairly minimalist approach and kind of placed our trust in our auditors and in their ability to evaluate a situation and make sure that all of the applicable requirements are being upheld. So we've created a special grid that appears within our audit report for recording the assessments, and we've instructed our auditors to ensure that they're sampling the applicable statutory and regulatory requirements at each and every audit. Now, in terms of examples of what is applying, these are some of the more preeminent requirements that we're seeing in the reports that are getting turned in. We're seeing a lot of references to OSHA, the PPE requirements, ergonomics, safety training, and so forth. Many of our clients are ITAR regulated. ITAR, of course, is a requirement that pretty much only applies here in the United States, applies to companies that work in defense, work in aerospace. This is obviously an example of statutory regulatory. Safety data sheets, SDS, what we used to know as MSDS. These very often get into handling and disposal. We see this in all types of areas. In fact, I think in all the years I've audited, I don't think I've ever been to a company that didn't have some form of safety data sheets that they had to maintain within their facility. So these are all examples of things that we're seeing referenced on the report. So in terms of how the auditors are determining what applies, remember that many of the things that we're already reviewing in the audit process are going to be helpful in determining what applies. So we've talked about contracts, right? Interface with customers. Well, we're already looking at that. That's required under Section 8.2. We're already looking at blueprints and specifications. And believe it or not, we're actually already looking at your website. These are all things that are looked at in the context of the audit, and all potentially are going to give us instances of statutory and regulatory requirements that we would then follow up on in the context of the audit. Now, I also want to emphasize to you something that we shared with our auditors, and that is the extent of our assessment and ensuring that we stay within the guidelines of what is mandatory. We want to confirm that you have an effective process for identifying and complying with the relevant requirements. So again, a reminder of what the wording is. We're going to include the management system ability and performance regarding meeting of applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. So to put it more plainly, our job is to ensure that you have an effective process in place, not to audit specific line items therein. We are ISO 9001 auditors. We are not OSHA auditors, EPA auditors, and so forth. That's not the intent here. So in terms of how the audit report grid might look when it's been filled in properly, I've got an example for you, and here it is. So let's pretend that we were auditing an aerospace company, a company that's ISO 9001 certified that sells to the aerospace industry. And we sample as part of our audit OSHA requirements, ITAR requirements, and DFARS requirements. So you can see here, again, the auditor is speaking in generalities, and basically just confirming that the overall process is effective. We're not digging into this for specific line items. We're not OSHA auditors. We're not ITAR assessors from the State Department. This is purely, do we have an effective process in place? Now, one of the more important questions that we get, and I can certainly understand this being a concern, is PJR going to issue a nonconformance? Well, it's conceivable that an auditor could find a disconnect between a process and an applicable statutory regulatory requirement. But what you have to remember is that for it to make that leap to being a nonconformance, we have to kind of take that with some discretion. Does it impact customer satisfaction? Does it impact quality objectives? Does it impede your ability to manufacture product or render your service? And again, these are not absolutes, but these are things that I attempted to emphasize to our audit team. So if a nonconformance is truly warranted, again, we have to be able to cite applicable audit criteria, preferably to include a portion of the ISO 9001 standard itself, which is why I mentioned the clause that I did, because that is the basis for why we're auditing in the first place. So in conclusion, we want to ensure that we are providing you with a value-added audit, meeting all applicable requirements. We certainly hope that this presentation will help you understand what our expectations are with regards to statutory and regulatory requirements. I do want to invite you to tune in for one of my other webinars. I have a presentation on ISO 9001 2015. It's presented roughly every other month. We've got a lot of content in there on understanding the standard and what our approach is going to be in the transition audit. I also have a special presentation on non-applicable clauses and what our expectations are on there. That's shown roughly every quarter. And we have a lot of other webinars. We have webinars on Stage 1 auditing, process maps, AS 9100, ISO 13485, and so forth. We definitely want to keep in touch with our clients, and the best way for us to do that is if you opt in for updates. So if you go to www.pjr.com, go to the bottom of the page, and give us your email address, click subscribe. You'll be automatically kept informed of the latest news from PJR, including news on standards and updates and things of this nature. I do thank you for your time and attention today. I'm going to go ahead and unlock the question portion of the dashboard and see if we have any questions today. Okay. Vani Mehta is asking, can I give examples of 833C and 822A1? So that's contracts and design. Vani, it's going to be very much dependent on what kinds of requirements are being raised by your customers. It's very much driven by the industry that you're in and the customers that you supply to. And unfortunately, I don't really have any good universal examples that I could share with you. It's going to be dependent very much on the industry that you're in and the customers that you work with. So I do apologize that I can't give a specific example. Any other questions today? Mary Lou Lonsdale asks, do we have to have a separate document to describe statutory regulatory requirements? No, absolutely not. You are simply required to demonstrate that you have a process for identifying what applies and that it's under control. The expectation the process, rather, I should say, for keeping those things organized would definitely be at your discretion. Okay. Santosh Mishra, where can we get a list of applicable laws and regulations for British Columbia, Canada? Santosh, I'm afraid I simply do not know. That might be a question. I don't know if you have a legal representative or someone that's versed in contractual law for British Columbia that you could speak to. It's not something that I would feel comfortable providing counsel on. Any other questions today? Okay. Ms. Lonsdale, you're asking for an example of the grid. I'm afraid that's actually a portion of PJR's audit report. I'm going to ask that you contact me offline and we can discuss your request. Kimberly Harone asks, do you have to have a consultant review statutory regulatory requirements? No, that is not an expectation. That can definitely be something that's managed internally. Dan Locke asks, there seems to be overlap with EMS and SMS for regulatory. Are there boundaries? I don't have any basis for speaking on EMS requirements. That's other folks here at PJR that manage those standards. I will say that there's definitely some bleed between them. I know that EMS, they typically go deeper in terms of assessment. Again, the QMS aspect of this is simply ensuring that there's a process in place, and perhaps most importantly, that we're not running afoul of anything that's being specified by the customer. Any final questions? Okay, well, thank you all for your time. Have a great day.